Hi everybody, and welcome back to Scary Interesting One. In this video, we will go north of 3 seriously shocking cavern stories. One of these elements, a ruthlessly difficult situation, which truly is the stuff of bad dreams. Then conversely, the other 2 component, probably the biggest caverns. Any place on the planet so as consistently watch your prudence is encouraged, assuming that you appreciate alarming fascinating chances, or that you appreciate accounts of mankind getting by, or some of the time not in probably the most troublesome circumstances on the planet. So today, I need to acquaint you with one of these accounts, which is a loathsomeness fiction web recording and YouTube channel, sat inside the chilling polar evening of Spalart, considered the White Vault. It's a sound story like unnerving, intriguing, yet with a full voice cast, where a worldwide salvage and fix group is shipped off, find the wellspring of a puzzling sign at a far-off icy examination station on their central goal. They become caught when the weather conditions gets ugly first, and they likewise make various stunning revelations hiding underneath the ice. What makes them White Vault especially disrupting, however, is that you feel like you're really with the group as they walk through the dark, cold snowscape. The makers of the show additionally go through incredible agonies to guarantee the logical, semantic, oral, and social precision. You can hear dialects like Icelandic, Arabic, Portuguese, Mandarin, and, surprisingly, jeopardized dialects like Manu and Yiddish. The White Vault additionally includes genuine sound from imperiled species like polar bears and Andean condors. The total story is likewise now accessible, so you can hear every one of the gathered records free of charge without looking out for new deliveries. Another season is likewise accessible on Spotify, which follows a couple of nature photographic artists in rustic Maine. There are likewise a few different seasons, which follow stories that would be here at home once alarm, fascinating like an archaic exploration group that endures a torrential slide in Patagonia and veer-off series in the Antarctic, Britain, Japan, and 18th century China, and by the manner in which the criticism that I've seen both in my remark area and their remark segment, starting from whenever they first supported video, has been fabulous. So I'd enthusiastically prescribe you head on over to their YouTube channel, or find them any place you listen, a digital recording to dig into the holding up repulsions on April 5th, 1990. A person named Robert, his sibling. What's more, a companion of theirs went through the night camp, close to a cavern named Recluse Cavern. Them 3 were nearby to do a few wild exercises and give a shot. Buckling, interestingly, Loner Cave is found someplace in the Forest Park region, close to Stronghold Gibson Lake in Oklahoma. Be that as it may, sadly, I was unable to track down the specific area. Sincerely, however, with how this story closes, it's likely great that the cavern isn't all the more notable. Quite a while back, Oklahoma and the establishing region were covered by water as a feature of an old ocean. Over the long haul, the water subsided and dissipated, abandoning immense stores of minerals. Then, notwithstanding that other geographical cycles push the fundamental layer of gypsum near the surface, gypsum is a genuinely delicate and effectively broke up mineral, so over the long run water concealed passages to structure the caverns present in Oklahoma and the encompassing region in light of the extra mineral store. A portion of these include huge and delightful precious stone developments inside them. Loner Cave, anyway, is practically the specific inverse. The cavern entrance is minimal in excess of a soil covered opening 2 FD wide and 3 FD long, and the remainder of it is similarly as unremarkable. In the wake of going through the night camp, close by, the companion that was with Robert and his sibling needed to leave to go to work. Yet rather than leave with him, Robert and his sibling needed to do some investigating specifically, albeit this was his most memorable time buckling. Robert needed to go into Loner Cavern and find out how far it turned out. Yet in addition, since this was his most memorable time buckling, Robert didn't actually have the foggiest idea what he was doing. It just appeared to be something great to do. This implied he took wasn't exactly ready and was simply wearing pants and a shirt, he likewise had one spotlight, no protective cap, and no reinforcement lights. He likewise probably had barely any insight into the terrible air present inside the cavern. This happens when a cavern has poor flow. The air inside isn't protected to relax for extensive stretches of time, yet one way or the other subsequent to just barely getting through the little opening, Robert and his sibling forged ahead through the undeniably close sections in the end. Robert went through a little side entry that appeared to limit considerably further. Then he got 50 FD in, then 100 FD in, and it was turning out to be so close it was difficult to try and take a full breath. Then at 150 feet in, there was a limitation that was the littlest direct they'd gotten towards such a long ways from Robert's vantage point. The passage appeared to point descending to the crush, and afterward extend out again a short time later. So subsequent to mulling over everything briefly, he chose to attempt to just barely get through it. At first he pushed his body forward with his arms at his sides as the passage pressed him increasingly tight. After some battle, Robert halted and acknowledged he was completely wedged. It was too close to even consider moving ahead, and on account of the point and in light of the fact that his arms are stuck by his sides, he needed more influence to propel himself in reverse. Surprisingly more terrible, he was left with his face right over the wet, sloppy floor of the cavern, in the wake of attempting frantically to free himself with no karma. His sibling attempted also, except for either couldn't contact him or just couldn't haul him out, so with no different choices, his sibling had to leave to go get help, leaving Robert in this rearranged position. Salvage groups and paramedics showed up not long from now, a while later, and Robert's sibling drove them to the little soil opening. Then, over the course of the following a few hours, the groups attempted to eliminate soil and shakes to enlarge the air enough to arrive at Robert to get him out. The whole time they were doing this, also air must be siphoned into the cavern in view of how awful the air quality was inside. On top of that, even the most slender paramedic to enter the cavern lacked the ability to take full breaths, almost to the limitation at long last they would arrive at Robert at 300 p.m. 5 hours after he'd stalled out, and unfortunately he was dead. He was face down in the mud and appeared to have passed on from suffocation. His body was ultimately pulled out of the cavern. However, it's not satisfactory assuming that he dropped because of the unfortunate air quality, or on the other hand, in the event that he just couldn't hold himself up any longer out of the mud. The tallest, most noticeable, and likely the most great mountain in the Canadian Rockies is Mount Robson, remaining at very nearly 13,000 feet or 4,000 m. Couple of miles east of Mount Robson is another mountain named Triplet Mountain, which is undeniably less great in level anyway. It's not simply the mountain that is amazing, it's what's within it. The nearest and just street going through this extraordinarily remote stretch of mountains is the Yellowhead Roadway. The actual thruway sits at 3,000 feet height. Then one more very nearly 4 million effed up from that point in favor of Triplet Mountain is the opening to the second most profound cavern in Canada, named Aramis Cave, at 1,760 feet profound, or 536 m profound. It's likewise one of the most profound caverns any place on Earth, and in addition to the fact that it is huge inside, it's unimaginably challenging to get to by walking. It's a 20 km climb through timberlands and around mountains from the parkway, which is normally finished north of a few days. This makes flying in by helicopter the most proficient yet. Clearly, in general, that is restrictively expensive. In addition, in spite of the fact that Aramis might be popular for its profundity, that is just important, but what makes it troublesome, the plunge to the base is separated into two segments, and the absolute first cavers need to navigate is known as the unending trip. Quite a bit of this segment is either incredibly steep or totally vertical shafts. The cavern levels out the more deeply you go, yet one way or the other. This implies cavers need to repulse down what are basically precipice faces inside a cavern. A significant number of these are additionally loaded up with super cold spillover from the encompassing mountains and icy masses. On the evening of October 17, 1991, Rick Dark, Chris Zimmerman, Hugo Mullick, and Ron Lell prepared themselves to be carried to the entry of Aramis Cave. Rick, Christ, and Hugo were occasional officers at Mount Robson Common Park, and every one of the four of the men were capable cavers. After the helicopter dropped the men off external, the entry to Aramis Cavern, they burned through brief period in getting the headquarters set up. Then they split into two gatherings. First, Rick and Chris entered. Then 3 hours after the fact, Ron and Hugo followed, and they all argued to get together later on. For the following couple of hours, they would work their direction increasingly deep into the earth when they arrived at a profundity of around 1,300 feet or 400 m at 11:30 that evening. They showed up at an upward shaft called the Boost at around 29 ft, between the edge of the boost to the floor beneath. It's not the most scary drop in the whole cavern yet. What makes it precarious, however, is the all-out freezing cascade that chairs need to repulse down and then, at that point, move back up through. It's exceedingly difficult to get past without getting splashed one way or the other. Once gotten, they slip-slide the boost each in turn. Then once they were at the base, they went to dive the following segment. When it was Rick's turn, he grasped the rope, played out a last security check, and crept his direction across the edge. Then a second after, the rope went top, with the full weight of Rick's body toward one side. It went slack. What Rick didn't know was that what he had attached the rope to wasn't bedrock. It was really a temperamental 400 kg rock. So when he began to move, his weight made the stone come free, and afterwards slide down on top of him. Rick's pelvis was then squashed by the stone, and he was thumped. Oblivious, the others immediately hurried to Rick's guide, and to their alleviation, he was alive, yet the agony of his wounds was extraordinary, and he was slurring his words when he came to. They didn't know the full degree of his wounds. However, his pelvis was possible broken. At any rate, there was zero chance he was getting out under his own power, since they were devoted seers. The men were learned in emergency treatment. However, Rick required considerably more serious clinical consideration. They truly had only two choices. They could attempt to complete Rick, or then again, two of them could leave looking for help, while the others remained with Rick in the cavern. At first, they attempted to convey him, yet they just moved him a couple of feet before he shouted for them to stop. Without a legitimate design, it was basically impossible that they could get him out without causing more harm. So with nothing else to do, they needed to separate. Chris remained with Rick, and afterward Hugo and Ron left to get help. It's hard to place into viewpoint exactly how overwhelming of a mission this was. A few caverns had parking garages just external the entry. In any case, escaping Arcus was just essential for the fight. The main quick way on or off the mountain was by helicopter. However, Hugo and Ron had no method for reaching out to the pilot. Their crisis radio likewise neglected to connect with the pinnacle, so to call crisis administrations, they would have to move out of the cavern, then, at that point, walk the 20 km to the throughway, and banner somebody down. Returning to the entry required just about 5 hours. Then, when they at long last arrived at the parkway, 14 hours had passed since they left Rick. What's more, Chris and they had strolled through the backwoods the entire night after Hugo and Ron left. Chris crouched close to Rick to keep them as warm as potential temperatures at that profundity were freezing, and it was inevitable before they got hypothermic, compounding the situation. They were in pitch obscurity. To protect their light, however much as could be expected, the two men switched their headlamps off and paid attention to the water pouring around them. There was minimal a greater number of they could do, other than shudder and trust that assist will was showing up when where the RCEMP were cautioned. To Rick's experience on the evening of October 18th, They assembled on numerous fronts. The commonplace government sent 3 planes to Vancouver Island to get seers with rest preparing to aid the work to save Rick's sporting cavers, likewise drove in from everywhere to offer their help too. At first late, toward the beginning of the day of October 19th, very nearly 36 hours after the occurrence, a helicopter dropped off the principal heroes, and afterward got back to get more while some salvage personnel were being moved. Others set up an enormous central command with tents in the valley underneath the cavern. Sadly, Rick and Chris were neglectful of how much movement was happening outside the cavern to contact them, and trust was blurring. On the morning of the 19th, their shuddering had deteriorated, and by then Chris, who was totally unharmed, was falling apart right close by Rick around 30 hours. Into this, Rick went to Chris and asked him to leave the cavern in the event that things continued to go like this. They'd both be dead inside the space of hours. Chris at first dissented, however Rick demanded he'd leave while her actually had enough in him to come to the entry he needed to consider it briefly. However hesitantly, Chris got together his stuff and let Rick know that he'd be back for him with assistance to bring him home at some point around noontime. Chris seen headlamps in the passage in front of him. The initial gathering of res were a fair distance into the cavern as of now, and they raced to Chris when they saw him. Chris then, at that point, let them know he was fine and given more data about Rick's condition before progress forward to the cavern entrance. Then at last that evening, Chris showed up at the entry of the cavern and was promptly kept an eye on. Crisis staff settled him before he was transported to a close-by clinic to be treated for hypothermia. Around similar time, heroes conveying clinical hardware, warming cushions, and dry apparel at last made it Rick. However, they were past the point of no return. Rick kicked the bucket presently. Before their appearance, the news in the long run cleared its path through to the salvage group, and many burst out crying, since the cavern in local area is somewhat little a considerable lot of them realized Rick well after the underlying shock of Rick's demise passed, and the salvage turned into a recuperation mission. Search and salvage would require an additional 2 days for a few groups of 10 to complete Rick's collection of Arcus Cave. A post-mortem was then acted in the corner German that there was no situation where Rick would make do. The trial, the second that Rock slipped his destiny, was fixed. The stone had gotten disastrous harm to Rick's body, including a considerable lot of his significant organs. Even with prompt clinical consideration at an exceptional medical clinic, the outcome would have been a similar. The dissection, moreover, showed that Rick's reason for death were the wounds he endured and not hypothermia, like a considerable lot of the heroes believed was the situation right up till now. The salvage with an Aramus Cave is the most broad in Canadian music history, in excess of a long time back. A gathering of local Americans from the Taimisha Shason clan meandered into the Mojave Desert and chose to remain. This desert is situated across a large part of the southern bits of California, Nevada, and the guide and boiling environment. There is an intriguing decision of spot to settle without a doubt anyway. In spite of this, individuals flourished in this frequently unfriendly climate to such an extent that around 300 of their relatives can in any case be found in the time today, right along the boundary of California, Nevada, in a part of the Mojave once possessed by this clans. It's a peculiar land, encompassed by fruitless desert on all sides. From high above it seems to be a little break in a cliffside, yet from down underneath it's more similar to a gorge. It enlarges to be around 8 ft wide and 60 feet long, and at the base is a gem clear geothermal pool, and the locals who knew about this pool would educate their youngsters a legend concerning what they called water babies that lived inside this water, evidently assuming the kids swam for a really long time in the water. They'd turn into a dinner for one of these water babies. A portion of the elderly folks even said that the pool was the entry to an organization of passages that mysterious shamans used to head out from one spot to another in the desert. Cutting-edge examinations and discoveries have found more regular clarifications for its presence. yet even still such a huge amount about. The pool referred to now as Fiend's Opening is as yet unclear, and this secret in the portrayals of its submerged magnificence and papers during the 1960s is precisely exact thing drew the interest of Paul Jean Contiere. Paul was a 19-year-old cafeteria laborer at a Nevada test site for atomic gadgets, and frequently talked with companions about Villain's expectation and the amount he needed to jump it, and about a year after he previously found out about it, he at last got his opportunity. Paul figured out how to persuade his companions, 20-year-old David Rose, 19-year-old Bill Change, and his sibling 20-year-old Jack Change, to go along with him. Then, on June 20th, 1965, the four of them made the 90m excursion to Villain's Opening. Presently, Fiend's Opening isn't simply some normal immaculate spring that you can take a comfortable swim in. Riliac limited region was encircled by only a wall in the 1960s, yet today it's significantly more safeguarded in light of multiple factors. Demon's Opening is not at all like elsewhere on the planet. It's accepted that it very well may be the most profound cavern on the planet, and at one time it was believed to be a doorway to an underground sea. Truth be told, only the water held inside it is generally huge water streams into Fiend's Hoe through a long organization of underground passages from a region of the desert where atomic weapons were tried, and Villain's Opening is one of the endpoints of this water, the sluggish underground water that beginnings as downpour or snow close to the test site gradually advances toward Villain's Opening throughout the span of 15,000 years. So because of the atomic test, radioactive water will start to fill the opening in another 15,000 years. Strangely too, it's additionally some kind of regular finder of seismic action tremors that happen in the western side of the equator, and as distant as Asia, cause numerous waves around 15 minutes after the fact at the entry to the pool, and nobody knows why. The most compelling motivation for safeguarding Fiend's Opening, anyway entertaining enough, is only a little fish known as Satan's Opening little guy fish. These radiant blue inch-long fish are found in the water in the opening and just in the water in the opening. A few specialists conjecture the pop fish have been there for no less than 20,000 years, except for how they arrived is hazy one way or another. They generate in the shallow limestone entry of the pool and carried on with their whole lives between the surface and 84 found benefiting from the limited quantity of green growth that fills in the stones in the water top. Guarantee the little guy fish would be safeguarded perpetually. President Harry Truman added the breadth around Villain Opening to the Demise Valley Public Park in 1952. Then during the mid-1960s, an expert jumper named Jim H.E.Z. was allowed to play out a progression of plunges at Demon's H2, investigate what was underneath the surface. Jim then, at that point, outlined what he saw during those jumps and started sorting out the most extensive comprehension of the design of the passages accessible. During this he tracked down that around 100 ft or 30 m. The enormous primary chamber transforms into a tight limitation known as the pipe. Then, once through it, jumpers enter a region known as section of land gorge. This chamber is enormous. It's around 300 ft long and 40 ft wide, and out of the way has a few vertical cylinders that lead to air pockets. Near the surface, the floor of this chamber is likewise sunken and plunges increasingly deep into an opening sufficiently wide for a jumper with air tanks to fit through. And since the entire restricted was as it slides, there is a descending current that gets increasingly strong the more profound you go. During his investigation, Jim went to the furthest extent that he would be able, yet never tracked down the genuine lower part of Fallen Angel's Opening. His disclosures anyway were earth-shattering, covered widely by the media's outcome. This is the means by which Paul came to find out about Fiend's soul. It was Jim's portrayals of the gleaming, brilliant stone walls of the principal chamber that impacted Paul to design a jump there. The thing is, Paul was not an expert jumper. He wasn't even a very remarkable jumper. At all, the main thing that could be viewed as an arrangement was the choice to go there. All the other things was a reconsideration stacking up their hardware for the excursion comprised of throwing several old air tanks, covers, snorkel and spotlights into a vehicle. So this wasn't precisely a complex outing when the gathering showed up nearby. Of Fiend's opening after twilight, they left the vehicle along Demon's opening street, snatched what little stuff they brought, and began the short stroll to the desert gap, a little more than a feigned villain's opening. An encompassing wall materialized, as did the advance notice signs cautioning guests to keep out. Tragically, the four men didn't actually see them as they scaled the wall and strolled down to the edge of the pool. Paul, David and Bill then, at that point, stripped down to their swimsuits and began to edge the pool close. The shallow limestone rack, so basic to the little guy fish, once they were there too. Jack chose not to go along with them, and on second thought watch out at the surface in the event that anybody spotted them. After some perky coaxing of Jack for retreating, the other three sneaked by the water surface. For Paul, the drop was all that Jim depicted to correspondence, since they need the front of dimness to pull this off. The daylight, bouncing off the vivid walls, was missing. However, they were all the while stunning in the spotlight bit. Subsequent at Tad, Bill's tank showed that his air supply was a lot of lower than expected for how much time they were submerged. He then, at that point, got Paul and David's consideration and gave his all to convey through motions that he wanted to get back to them. Re-emerged, however, there was no indication of him by any means. There were no air pockets, no weak light emission more profound down, only nothing. At first, they figured Paul might have adjusted his perspective during rising and had sufficient air to remain longer, yet David and Paul would have rather not taken a risk in any case. Unexpectedly terrified that their companion may be in a difficult situation, they wildly plummeted into the water again. As they got farther from the water surface, they got increasingly more restless. There were still no air pockets emerging from underneath them, and there were no indications of Paul's light anyplace. It was all dimness then. When they arrived at the 175 FD imprint, Bill needed to rush back to the surface. He needed more air to go any further, and he probably won't have even had enough to successfully return without flagging David. Bill began a quick climb then. When he jumped out of the water at the surface, Bill and Jack took a gander at one another and knew without saying a word that this was terrible, and the circumstance was terrible enough with Paul missing. However, subsequent to sitting tight at the surface for some time for David, they understood he wasn't coming back either. Bill then, at that point, rushed out of the water and ran back to the vehicle with Jack, and with no other choice they sped southeast down a forsaken desert street, 90 miles to Las Vegas. Before sunup on June 21st, the inquiry and salvage group from the sheriff's specialization and a few Demise Valley Public Park perils begin to show up at Dell's opening. When they found out about the crisis, police settled on a telephone decision to a jumper they knew could find the missing men, and that individual was Jim, a similar man who incidentally and unexpectedly propelled the men to be down there. At everything was presently accused of finding them. Jim then coordinated the jumpers and dole out jobs to every one of them before a modest bunch of them plummeted into Demon's opening. In the interim, individuals from Paul and David's family fired, appearing at Villain's opening in no time. A short time later, as well, and as though the entire circumstance required any more misfortune, Paul and David had formally joined similar family. Only a couple of months sooner, David wedded Paul's sister, and the two companions had been acclimating to life as brothers by marriage. By then, Paula stood crying beyond Demol, with the developing possibility of losing her sibling and spouse simultaneously for the following 36 straight hours. Jim and 44 salvage jumper looked relentless for Paul and David. Sadly, all they found were a cover and snorkel, as well as an electric lamp attached to a stone around the 100-foot imprint. Likely as a mark of what direction the exit was. Unfortunately, neither of the men appear to have found this pointer. During one of these jumps, Jim and his accomplice got in contact with a profundity line, which is with a weight on it. Evidently, this line got to a profundity of 932 ft, while never contacting a base. Jim then named the segment the vastness room, yet the two chose not to investigate in light of the profundity. Little entry, and the solid momentum streaming into it. At long last, the inquiry was cancelled on the night of June 22 and right around 60 years after the fact their bodies have still never been found.